What is the opening line of your favorite Disney animated film? Do you know? I was curious to find out. What is the foot that most of these films step off on? How do they hook the audience into the story? And of course, me being the nerd that I am, I wanted to do some interesting quantification. I was curious about things like, are opening sentences getting shorter over the time? Is the vocabulary level changing? Does the opening line introduce the audience to the protagonist, or is it world building, or what? And I figured there would be a lot of other people also interested in my findings. Now, I don't know the end results, but there are a couple of things that I'm curious to find out. One of which is how many of these opening lines are not said by protagonist, because I'm pretty sure it's the vast majority of them. That being said, I'm going to do a deep dive into all the Disney animated films, but I do have some rules because the Disney animated film moniker is a little bit vague. So, no Pixar, even if Disney owned it or were good terms at the time. Nope. No package films, so no Ichabod and Mr. Toad. I mean, those are fun movies, but really each section has its own beginning, and so that just doesn't work. That's too confusing. Whatever Victory through Air Power is, yeah, that's God. And no Disney tunes, so no Goofy Movie or DuckTales. Sorry, fans, but we're going for the real theatrical, big budget movies, and yeah. I think that pretty much covers it. And so that will end up, according to my count, according to the criteria, 52 movies to go through. So let's not waste any time. Let's go back to the very first, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Oh, I should add, if the opening is music, as in like an opening theme song, I'm not counting that. I am going to count on-screen text because that's exposition. But I am not going to count the opening Alice in Wonderland theme song. Alice in Wonderland is not the opening line of Alice in Wonderland. What is? Oh, you'll find out in a minute. But first, Snow White. Snow White opens with the classic storybook beginning, and it has on the page, "Once upon a time, there lived a lovely little princess named Snow White." Kind of an interesting opening line, right? We certainly know that Snow White is lovely, but the little is an interesting choice. Now, I think that the writers specifically were trying to get across vulnerability. When you're smaller, you used to seem a little bit fragile. You can think of the opening of Star Wars, to be honest, where you have the little ship being pursued by the bigger ship, right? As soon as you say something is smaller, we start to feel a little bit protective of it. So I think that's what they're going with. But of course, the once upon a time, the classic tropey beginning of a fairy tale story. Quite a few Disney movies begin with once upon a time. Let's keep a little tally for that. Next, we have Pinocchio. And this one does begin with an opening theme song, the iconic When You Wish Upon a Star. But the opening line is pretty, huh? Rather simple opening line for a story, but it does humanize Jiminy Cricket, who could very easily become a curmudgeon difficult to deal with character, since he's going to have to keep Pinocchio from doing all the fun things that he wants to do. It is quite an understatement to the beautiful beginning, which has become Disney's iconic theme song, and it's worth discussing just for a bit. The opening line, "When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come to you," is, of course, a rather profound thing to say. The idea that wishing upon a star is something that anybody can do, that anybody can aspire to something great, or ask the universe for something that is a deep rooted desire, and it will, in fact, manifest itself in front of you. Well, yeah, that's some strong stuff. Pretty, huh? Yeah, pretty. Moving on to Dumbo, and if you remember this opening line, you're really good. "Through the snow and sleet and hail, through the blizzard, through the gale, through the wind and through the rain, over mountain, over plain, through the blinding lightning flash and the mighty thunder crash, ever faithful, ever true, nothing stops him. He'll get through." It almost, sounds poetic as some sort of grandiose beginning. And ultimately, what's going through all of this? The one character that gets through, Mr. Stork, who brings Mrs. Jumbo Dumbo. Now, This is a bit of an odd beginning because ultimately, the story is not about the stork. However, I do think it works very well thematically about what this story is about, which is perseverance. Dumbo is about to have, of course, a very stormy life. He is about to be met with a barrage of bullying, and it's only through his perseverance and him looking deep within himself that he is going to find true happiness. Now let's move on to Bambi. This movie takes a very long time to establish any dialogue. In fact, the movie Bambi doesn't feature nearly as much dialogue as the other Disney animated films. It's a lot more about the world building. And so it's not a surprise that the opening line is a bit jarring. Wake up. Now, it might seem a little humorous to writers to hear about a story beginning with somebody waking up because we're often told never do that. It's such a cliche. However, the story Bambi is about the circle of life, right? And so the idea that we're waking up to encounter a birth of the new prince, well, that's a pretty good opening, if you ask me. And you're going to find a similar echo of this opening in The Lion King, which begins with a sunrise leading to the birth of another prince. Of course, Simba in that case. Now let's move on past those package features I talked about and to Cinderella. Now, Cinderella does have an opening theme song, but then it opens to the classic storybook and to the opening line. Once upon a time in a faraway land, there was a tiny kingdom. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Yeah, it is very similar to the opening line of Beauty and the Beast, which is going to begin, spoiler alert, once upon a time in a faraway land, a young prince lived in a shining castle. Now, you'll notice there's a bit of a difference in the way that those sentences end. In Cinderella, you begin with a tiny kingdom. In Beauty and the Beast, you begin with a shining castle. And in Beauty and the Beast, you're going to have a prince that's knocked down a few pegs, whereas Cinderella, again, similar to Snow White, I think it's speaking to vulnerability, to quaintness, to something that isn't imposing. Ultimately, Cinderella is going to want to become queen or princess or, marry into royalty. So we don't want it feeling imposing or stuffy or things like that. We want it to feel beautiful and cute. Moving on, we have Alice in Wonderland. Now, this one's a bit odd because we actually come in mid sentence. The mid sentence is leaders and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. I think we're coming in mid sentence for a couple of reasons. One is because, well, Alice's attention is divided. So she's kind of listening and half listening, so getting a half sentence makes sense. Of course, another reason why I think we're coming in mid sentence is it's a bit disorienting. Now, the language is already designed to be disorienting towards children. You're not generally going to plunge right into that sort of syntax or a usurpation and conquest or whatever. Yeah, you're going to hear blah, 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 which is perfect because that's what Alice is hearing. But even as an adult, coming into a line in the middle like that is a bit confusing. And so, again, it puts us in the character of Alice in Wonderland. Now let's go on to Peter Pan. Again, we have an opening song with second star to the right, but the opening line is, all this has happened before, and it will all happen again, but this time it happened in London. Now, it sounds a little bit like it should be the beginning of the book, right? It has a very book-like opening, but the beginning of Peter Pan actually goes, all children, except one, grow up. Why would Disney change such an iconic line as that? It's just speculation, but I wonder if it's because all children except one grow up refers to Peter Pan. Immediately, our focus is on Peter Pan, whereas all this has happened before and will happen again. Well, that's much more inclusive because it's possible that such a thing could happen to us. And the way that the Disney film Peter Pan works is very cyclical. The parents see the ship outside their window and they realize that they had seen such a thing before. And, their children will see it and then their grandchildren will see it and it'll keep going. And so I do think that there is a little bit of a difference in the emphasis in the Disney version, which is one reason for this change. Let's move on to Lady and the Tramp.
We have our first epigraph. In the whole history of the world, there is but one thing that money cannot buy, to wit, the wag of a dog's tail. It also continues with a dedication. This thematic statement really makes it quite clear what the story is going to be about, what to expect from it, and yeah, sets the tone really nicely.
Now let's move on to Sleeping Beauty. In a faraway land long ago lived a king and his fair queen. Apparently, we're totally done with Once Upon a Time, but we're still in a faraway land. Now, you'll notice one interesting thing about this sentence is the king doesn't get an adjective, but the queen does, the fair queen. And ultimately, in the story, the queen doesn't really do very much. So that's kind of an interesting emphasis. Now let's look at 101 Dalmatians. My story begins in London. And here we have the first instance of the first line being given by the protagonist, in this case, Pongo. Now, the opening line is not terribly exciting. My story begins in London. Although the next line talks about how even though it wasn't long ago, so many things have happened, it feels like an eternity, which of course is more of a hook. But I think it's a simple conversational beginning, and as we have the protagonist narrating their own story, it gives you a sense of the style and the tone of this work. Very down to earth, contemporary, different than what Disney offered in the past. Next stop on the tour is The Sword and the Stone. Opening line is, and below the hilt in letters of gold were written these words: Whoso pulleth out this sword of the stone and anvil is rightwise king.
Born of England.
Quite a hook, right? And I think one of the reasons it dives right into that is, of course, well, it's the title of the movie, The Sword and the Stone, but also this legend is rather well known. Most adults in the audience already know the legend of the Sword and the Stone, and maybe some of the kids don't. So let's catch them up. Everybody's on the same page, and yeah, it's still a good hook. Coming up next is The Jungle Book. The opening is, many strange legends are told of these jungles of India, but none so strange as the story of a small boy named Mowgli. Ha! There's that small again. I'm telling you, it's going to be a verbal tick you're going to notice now forever. And to avoid sounding like a broken record, yes, it is speaking of vulnerability, and that is ultimately the story of The Jungle Book. How will this vulnerable young boy survive in the jungle? Or should he even stay in the jungle? Is this really the rightful home for a young boy? Now, I do like this sort of marketing copy here going on. It's like, there's so many strange stories in India, but this is the strangest of them all. Yeah, I'm not so sure if it quite lives up to that, but yeah, it's a hook. And now the Aristocats. Obviously begins with the title song, but the opening line of dialogue is, Marie, my little one, you're going to be as beautiful as your mother. Again, little, sorry, it's going to come up a lot. Vulnerability. And yes, we also are showing the relationship between the cats and their owner. And this, of course, is the driving force behind the entire conflict of the movie. So, yeah, perfect way to start, if you ask me. Let's look at Robin Hood.
Long ago, good King Richard of England departed for the Holy Land on a great crusade. A rather straightforward and stilted beginning, which is quickly interrupted by Alan a Dale saying,
There've been a heap of legends and tall tales about Robin Hood. All of a sudden, we have quite the diction difference, don't we? Alan a Dale, the narrator of Robin Hood, speaks in this folksy sort of way, which is a strong contrast to this more stilted or formal language of narrators of Disney's past. Robin Hood has that sort of folksy, relaxed, calm sort of attitude throughout. It is not nearly as dramatic or dark or intense as some of the other stories. There was the thought of it being more like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or something like that. It's a fun heist sort of story. And it's really brought home with Roger Miller doing the music and also this opening narration. Moving on from Robin Hood, we have The Rescuers. Good day, sir. Okay, I do need to back up and say, yes, there is a prologue where Penny goes out and throws a bottle, and there's the opening song, The Journey, which is highly dramatic in all its 70s glory. But this matter-of-fact line, good day, sir, yeah, we're beginning media res. Something immediately is happening. A bunch of agents are gathering at the Rescue Aid Society to find out what is going on, and we're going to be thrust right into a story here. It is more or less a thriller sort of pacing, which Yeah, Rescuers is basically a adventure slash thriller story. I do think the fact that the first line is Bernard showing deference, of course, immediately puts him in that humble position. Bernard is the janitor who's plucked from obscurity by Bianca and led on this grand adventure, and it does provide a nice contrast when he's quite the hero at the end of the story. Let's take a look at the Black Cauldron. Opening line is, legend has it, in the mystic land of Prydain, there once was a king so cruel and so evil that even the gods feared him. Yeah, pretty dark, right? Creepy, distant. It's a very stilted, stoic sort of narration, but even the gods feared him. Obviously, we're beginning with a lot of tension, and The Black Cauldron is one of Disney's darkest movies. Moving on to The Fox and the Hound. You poor little fella. I'm sorry, little again, but this time there's a poor in front of it. It's a poor little fella. And again, we have some diction going on with fella, right? Big Mama, who is the character who says this line, has a very modern vernacular. And Fox and the Hound was, attempting to change the formula up a little bit, become a bit more relevant. You could definitely argue it's an edgier movie, and the dialogue is meant to sound more like modern conversation than some of the films in the past. Next, we have The Great Mouse Detective. You know, Daddy, this is my very best birthday. Charming beginning line right in the middle of a scene here, and we all know when a character says, this is the best day of my life, that things are about to go south in a hurry. So it's a little bit of reverse psychology on the part of the writers. They know what they're doing. They know that they are signposting that something bad is about to happen. And it's about to happen to a kid who's talking to their father, you know what, Daddy, this is my very best birthday. Very best, adding that adverb in. It sounds more juvenile and cute. We're on the side of this character and immediately wondering, yeah, when is the shoe gonna drop? What's gonna happen? Now let's talk about Oliver and Company. This one is a bit tricky to identify. Of course, there's the opening song with the opening line. Now, it's always Once Upon a Time in New York City, which you could probably argue is really the opening line of this movie. However, keeping to my strict rules here, the first line of dialogue is hard to identify because Oliver is like walking around and it's sort of ambient noise and it's a little bit cacophonous and it's like, what am I supposed to pick out exactly? I am going to go on the side of saying that the opening line is, hey, come on, folks, step right up, get your hot dogs. Which sets up the opening scene where Oliver is terrible at getting hot dogs. Dodger is quite adept at it, and he starts teaching him all of his thievery tricks. Let's sail on to The Little Mermaid. Opening line, isn't this great? This is the first time that the opening song is going to get interrupted by the first line. Now, Fathoms Below begins with, I'll tell you a tale of the bottomless blue and its hey to the starboard heave ho, which is a great world building song. But getting back to Prince Eric's line, isn't this great? There's a parallel, in my opinion, to what Ariel says, which is, isn't it neat? Right? Obviously, the two are destined for one another. Let's look at Rescuers Down Under. The opening line,
Cody.
isn't exactly memorable, but as an action movie, you expect to start with action. And this movie does. It really has a thriller type pacing, much quicker than the original Rescuers. Next, we have Beauty and the Beast. Opening line, which I already spoiled. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, a young prince lived in a shining castle. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between this and Cinderella is in that situation, the castle is part of a charming kingdom. It's a tiny kingdom. Whereas in this situation, the castle is a shining castle. It is drawing our attention, and what comes next is the prince is going to be dropped down a few pegs because of his selfishness. I think it was very clever for them to echo the phrasing so closely because this movie was trying to reinvigorate the Disney brand, and it did it.
Next, we have the movie Aladdin.
Ah, salam and good evening to you, worthy friend. The opening is pretty straightforward. Granted, it's definitely in the voice of that narrator character, but it's not until the next couple lines where it starts to get silly and we zoom in too close that the movie really captures its tone. And now let's move on to The Lion King. Life's not fair, is it? Of course, once again, we have a fantastic opening theme song, The Circle of Life, which sets the tone and the theme of the story. The opening line is really strong as well. Here we have the introduction to Scar, character we haven't seen before, and he's giving his morose and snarky commentary on how the world works. Interesting fact to note, this is the first time an antagonist has the opening line.
Let's move on to Pocahontas.
Hey, look! Or, hey, look, is that Smith? This is a bit of an awkward sort of way to introduce who somebody is. It's like, oh, look, it's John Smith. Yeah, I mean, it's a way to get a character introduction out of the way, but it's a little clunky. Let's be honest, Pocahontas is not necessarily Disney's strongest script. Now, as I pointed out with many of these others, it does begin with a lyric, which is, in 1607, we sailed the open sea for glory, God, and gold in the Virginia Company, which, yes, that's a better opening line, particularly the glory, God, and gold. That's a typical format where you have two things, and then the third thing is a little bit unexpected. Not a complete non sequitur, but immediately grabs your attention, right? Ah, a little bit greedy, are they? Let's move on to the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Listen, they're beautiful, no? Once again, we have an opening line that talks about something being attractive or beautiful. But again, like a lot of those opening lines, it's really referring to a depth of beauty and not just superficial beauty. I think it's interesting that it begins with the directed to the audience to listen. Listen, they're beautiful, no? Because later on in this opening, it's going to say, here is a riddle to guess if you can. There is something about the way that Colpan is interacting with the audience that is asking us to engage in the story. And in many ways, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a more sophisticated and nuanced story than Disney tended to offer. Let's continue on with Hercules. Opening line by the narrator is, long ago, in a faraway land of ancient Greece, there was a golden age of powerful gods and extraordinary heroes. And the greatest and strongest of all these heroes was the mighty Hercules. Now, it's only a couple of lines later that this stilted narration is interrupted by the more energetic muses. And this is definitely a riff on the classic Once Upon a Time, although because this is a Greek myth, they instead go with long ago, although they keep the in a faraway land. Speaking of which, depending on where you are in the globe, but Greece is not all that far from you, and it's certainly not some obscure place we've never heard of before, so interesting choice to go with the faraway land, if you ask me. Let's move on to Mulan. Opening line is, we're under attack. Mulan begins with quite the action-packed opening. Now, and this is rather unpopular opinion, but I'm not the biggest fan of Mulan because of the tonal shifts that occur within the film. We go from this action-packed war dramatic story to Eddie Murphy stand-up riffing Mushu. Yeah, it doesn't quite blend for me. And I will say that tonally, this does not really jive with the more Aladdin sort of feeling that we're going to get later on. So, yeah, it's an interesting choice. However, it does, of course, set the stage for a lot of the great action sequences that are all throughout the movie. Opening line of Tarzan, Mummy, look! Yes, again, we have a situation where a lot of exposition, a lot of plot is all throughout this big, grandiose opening number. But Turk actually gets the opening line, which is an introduction of all the characters to Tarzan. It's rather similar to the beginning of the Jungle Book, where they're debating, what do we do with this baby and all of that. And it sets the conflict of the movie, which is Tarzan figuring out where he belongs. Again, very similar to Jungle Book. However, what is not similar to the Jungle Book is the dramatic action-packed sequence at the beginning and the Phil Collins enriched opening anthem. The lyrics go, put your faith in what you most believe in, which I don't really know if that's what Tarzan is about. It's about putting your faith in something. Two worlds, one family. I mean, it does seem like a little bit of just a platitude that hangs in the air that doesn't really jive with the story, if you ask me, but not the biggest Tarzan fan, to be honest. Next, we had The Emperor's New Groove. Opening text is long ago, somewhere deep in the jungle. And I really should include that immediately Cusco, the narrator, cuts in with, "Will you take a look at that?" We have tone. We also have a protagonist speaking about themselves. We haven't really seen that since Pongo in 101 Dalmatians, so that's a little unusual. But Cusco, of course, sets the tone with his snarky commentary about what is happening and immediately tells us this is not a story we're supposed to take at all seriously. This is a farce. Let's take a look at Atlantis, the Lost Empire.
On screen text reads, "In a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea." And the following opening line is,
"You fool, you've destroyed us all." This marks the first time the opening line was not in English, although it's not in any language, it's in Atlantean. It's not a surprise with this being an adventure story that we begin with an action sequence and "you fool, you destroyed us all." High stakes. Atlantis has quite a high body count for a Disney movie, particularly if you think of how many are identified in the movie as dying. I will say Atlantis hasn't necessarily stood the test of time as a major classic, but it does have its fans. One of the reasons why I think it's successful is its pacing. It's quick. And yes, it begins with this epic, exciting action sequence, and it's pretty much full blazes ahead for the entire film. Doesn't really let its foot off the gas. Moving onward to Lilo and Stitch. This one is interesting. The opening line is, "Read the charges." Yeah, we're beginning with a courtroom scene. It's a little dark, and Lilo and Stitch does have quite an edge to it. This is a story that is about family trauma and second chances and, a killing machine essentially being reformed. We're not beginning with a human character, we're beginning with the alien character and the origin story. This is very similar to the way a monster movie might set up the threat before you get to the main characters. However, of course, in this situation, Stitch isn't entirely threatening. He's more mischievous, needs to be reformed. He's not Jaws. Let's keep going to Treasure Planet. Opening line by the narrator is, "On the clearest of nights when the winds of the Eltherium were calm and peaceful, the great merchant ships with their cargoes of Arcturian solar crystals felt safe and secure." Similar to Peter Pan, you might think that this is direct lift off of the novel Treasure Island. However, the novel Treasure Island has a very different beginning. It goes, "Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there's still treasure not yet lifted, I take up my pen in the year of grace 17 and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the saber cut first took up his lodging under our roof." Phew, that's an opening line. But I have to say, between the two, Treasure Island is better. It sounds like a distinct dialect. It's an interesting voice. I'm curious about what is going to happen. I like the idea of it feeling like a real event that happened and there's certain particulars kept from us. The long sort of run-on sentence feels very conversational. Treasure Planet is stilted, and that's kind of a problem throughout the film Treasure Planet. I don't know if it ever found its footing from a writing standpoint. Now, I do think visually it's quite interesting. I do like the whole steampunk aesthetic. But writing wise, it was hard to really find its tone, and I think that's clear even from this opening line, to be honest. Continuing on to Brother Bear. This is a story from long ago, when the great mammoths still roamed our lands. Once again, we have the long ago, but it's interesting that they specifically give us a time frame where mammoths roamed our lands, so we have a sense of when it happened. In fact, it doesn't make the long ago necessary. I do think its inclusion is to harken back to those other lines of the past. To be honest, I'm not sure if this movie really needed this sort of opening. I feel like it could have just begun right in the middle of action. Uh, I guess it wanted to sound more fairy tale like, but it doesn't have enough distinction. I wish that it felt more specific to itself. Moving on, we have Home on the Range with the opening line, Home on the Range. Yeah, this is the first time that the movie title is quoted as the opening line, and it sort of says it all. And you think of Home on the Range, you don't think of anything that has any lasting impact. So yeah, let's just begin with the opening title. Why not? After that comes Chicken Little. Now, where to begin? How about Once Upon a Time? And then we have Disney getting a bit snarky or meta about itself, right? The Chicken Little era is where we start to turn on the Disney formula a little bit, and it's about being subversive. So Once Upon a Time is being used ironically. Of course, this is a reaction to things like Shrek and just general commentary about the Disney films. And if you ask me, one of the biggest problems Chicken Little has is it's really more reactionary and trying not to be like other Disney movies than it is trying to be its own distinct self. At least if you ask me. Then we have Meet the Robinsons. Then I didn't choose that one because it was gonna give me pimples. So I chose another scary one because for all those years that I went for Halloween, I wasn't scary at all. It's a more disorienting line. Here we are coming into the middle of a conversation and we have a characters talking and, it seems to be the friend of the main character. Of course, this character becomes more important in the story. I won't ruin it if you've never seen the movie before. And yeah, I think that's a bit of a tip of the hat that we should be paying attention to this character. Although, as we've established, protagonists generally don't get the opening line anyway, so not really too obvious about where the movie is going to go next. Of course, the dialogue is very conversational with grammatical errors like I choose one and the sort of run-on sentence that ends up being a whole thing about dressing up for Halloween and not fighting a scary outfit. So, yeah, I think it's a strong opening, honestly. Continuing on with Bolts. The opening line is that one. Yeah, Bolt. That one. I would describe Bolt as an economical movie. It gets the job done. It doesn't have a lot of bloat. It is just straightforward with what it's trying to do, but it's not all that distinctive in of itself. It more or less just kind of goes through the motion. So, yeah, that one. It fits. Jumping back to 2D animation again, we have The Princess and the Frog. Opening line is, just in that moment, the ugly little frog looked up with his sad round eyes and pleaded, "Oh, please, dear princess, only a kiss from you can break this terrible spell that was inflicted on me by a wicked witch." Quite the power-packed sentence, right? Really long, but it's meta in that the fairy tale Princess and the Frog is being referred to in The Princess and the Frog, which means we're alerted to the fact this is going to go a different direction than what we expect. And of course, in the Disney version, when she kisses the frog, she turns into a frog as well. Quite the twist. Did you notice the word? Did ya? Yep, little. It's back. Ugly little frog. Again, broken record, vulnerability. Let's look at Tangled. Opening is, this is the story of how I died. Now, I bet you might have remembered that one. This is one of the most hooky openings of a Disney movie because you're just thinking, "Wait, what?" You think that a Disney movie is going to start with Once Upon a Time, maybe a cute little introduction, but whoa, that escalated quickly. Now, the following lines clarify that this is not going to be a tragic story, but then that even confuses you further. How could a story about somebody dying be good, and how is this related to Rapunzel? And so many questions. Really, really strong opening line here. And again, I bet you remembered that one. Let's look at Winnie-the-Pooh. Now, I know I skipped over many adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh because that was a package feature. Winnie-the-Pooh, I don't really consider a package. Opening line is, this could be the room of any small boy, which in fact is the opening line of the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh as well. Again, we have small, demure, humble. It's relatable, and of course, the fact that it's a young boy, well, children immediately can relate to it. It could be their room, right? We're getting inclusive, and the language of it being, well, this could be any small boy makes it feel like, well, this could be your room. And even though it goes on to clarify that it's the room of Christopher Robin, again, the fact that it opened it up to, well, it could be anybody's room means, well, all of us could have such an adventure ourselves. Let's take a look at Frozen. Elsa. We have a one word opening line, and it is a character. Now, it is not really in who I would consider the main character of Frozen. I consider it to be Anna. In fact, I consider Elsa to be the antagonist if you look at how that story is structured. But it's a character nonetheless, and it is a featured character of the story. Now, put a pin in this opening line because I think you're going to find the Frozen 2 opening line interesting. But before we get to that, how about Wreck-It Ralph? Opening line, my name's Ralph, and I'm a bad guy. It's a pretty solid character hook, particularly the phrase bad guy, right? We understand what that tends to mean, and certainly in terms of a video game, which we see presented on the screen, we understand who the villains of video games tend to be. So the fact that we have a bad guy and he's just saying, hey, my name is Ralph in a very casual way, well, we're interested to see what will come next. Big Hero 6. Get up! Yep, we're getting shorter and shorter with our opening lines here, right? Big Hero 6 begins with Hero in the middle of a battle bot sort of fight. So we're right in the middle of action. And yes, Big Hero 6 is an action story. But the concept of get up is interesting because ultimately the whole story of Big Hero 6 is about Hero picking himself up after the tragic death of his brother. And so Get Up is very much the theme of the movie. So, yeah, good job there, writers. Next, we have Zootopia. Fear, treachery, bloodlust. Thousands of years ago, these were the forces that ruled our world. Very strong opening line. We establish all of these terrible things, but then we also establish that they're in the past. And that, of course, gives you a bunch of questions. How did they solve it? Will it come back? Etc., etc. So, great world building. Also, some pretty negative words to start us off. And Zootopia is a rather edgy movie, if you think about it. Has blood in it and some violence. So, yeah, it's warning you a little bit that this is not going to be a soft movie. Now, let's move on to Moana. Opening line. In the beginning, there was only ocean until the mother island emerged, Tafiti. Another world building line and another strong one. As you're probably aware, Tafiti is the driving force of all of the action of the film. Moana is trying to restore the heart of Tafiti, and that forms her entire adventure. It might seem a little bit like an exposition dump, but because it goes right into conflict and it sets some intrigue, it does give it a fairy tale-like opening. But notice the difference. It's not long ago. It is in the beginning. So this is an origin story. Fascinating, isn't it? Next, we have Frozen 2. I hope you remember the opening line for Frozen, because the opening line for Frozen 2 is Anna, Elsa. Yes, we get both names this time. Anna comes first, and that makes sense. Although, you might be able to argue that Elsa's more of the protagonist in Frozen 2. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Moving along, we have Raya and the Last Dragon. I know what you're thinking. Do you know what I'm thinking? I think one of the reasons to jump in like this is just to give it that conversational tone and attempt to make a connection with the audience. Following that, we have Encanto, Open Your Eyes. And Open Your Eyes is a really strong thematic statement. The whole movie is about revelations. It's about learning more about the family. It's about seeing what is right in front of them. Just a couple left now. We have Strange World. Welcome, explorers, to Avalonia. I mean, it's an adventure story. This movie didn't exactly catch fire, and the opening line is okay. The last film I'm going to cover is Wish. I actually haven't seen Moana 2 yet, but we'll look at it whenever I do. Once upon a time, there was a young man who believed there was nothing more important than a wish. The once upon a time is not really a surprise because Wish, of course, was designed for the 100th anniversary. It's a classic fairy tale about the wishing star. What is interesting is we're missing little or small or anything like that. We have a young man, just young, no other adjective involved. And it's an interesting choice. It certainly keeps it feeling different than a lot of the opening lines we saw from those classic Disney animated films. Now, just to parse this out a bit further, it is a bit of an inversion on Pinocchio. Pinocchio begins with just the statement that, when you wish upon a star makes no difference who you are. In this script, you have a young man who believed there was nothing more important than a wish. And the fact that he believed it and the narrator is not really taking a side one or the other makes you believe that that's actually wrong. And so, or at least could be wrong. It's not a definitive, yes, wishing is amazing kind of statement. It's essentially saying, well, wishing may not be all it's cracked up to be, or at least we can start to question that. And as I said earlier, a lot of the films in this era have been reactionary films that are critical or making commentary of the Disney films of the past. All right, so it's time to look at those tallies and see what we got. In terms of where the opening line is coming from, 16% of them come from on-screen text, 22% from a narrator, 16% from a protagonist, 13% from a mentor character, and 33% from somebody else. It's not really a surprise to me that the protagonist would skew so low. It's also not a surprise to me that the largest amount of characters speaking that opening line are not protagonists or mentors. Average words in an opening line are 10.8, which is about what you would expect. It's about an average line in a book or something like that. And also, as I guessed earlier, lines are getting shorter. If we look at the last 10 opening lines, we're down to 7.3 words. So yes, we are jumping to quicker sentences and pacing is tightening. We can feel that though, right? Now, it might surprise you, but there are only 4 Disney movies that explicitly start with Once Upon a Time: Snow White, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and Wish. However, Chicken Little does mention Once Upon a Time in passing as a potential opening. But as much as that is a cliche or a trope, it's not exactly. That's only 10% of the opening lines that we discussed. One thing that I hope this deep dive shows is that really there's a lot of variety in how Disney tends to open up their stories. And I do think sometimes authors tend to pigeonhole themselves into formulas, and that's not always necessary. There are many ways of getting an audience's attention at the beginning of a work, and we've just seen some great examples. I'd love to know which of these opening lines you find the most iconic, and which ones perhaps surprised you the most. And if you'd like to see some more completist deep dives about patterns within Disney movies, please let me know as well. It's always helpful to know what people find engaging. So yeah, like, subscribe, do all the things, and I'll see you real soon.